Welcome and happy Social Work Month. March is Social Work Month for those of you who are unaware. So happy Social Work Month to all of the social workers out there. My name is Sarah Sims, and I'm the manager of continuing education for the Brown School here at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for joining us for today's Open Classroom program. Open Classroom is the Brown School's virtual and free professional development series. Beyond Open Classroom, we are the largest provider of continuing education units in the state of Missouri and Illinois. So if you're looking for CEUs, or if you just want some deeper learning, I invite you to check out our website. That's brownschool.boostal.edu. I'll put a link in the chat, and you can navigate to the resources and initiatives tab to find out more about what we offer. We offer something nearly every week year round. So we hope to see you back for some of our other offerings. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. So the first thing is that this is a Zoom webinar, so we can't see or hear any of the attendees today, but you can chat with us. So we'd love to, hear from you where you're zooming in from. And then throughout the presentation, we'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, and most importantly, your questions, because there will be time for Q&A at the end. We're also live streaming on YouTube. I'll put a link to the chat in just a moment for that. And a recording will also be posted on YouTube. All right, so jumping right in, I want to go ahead and welcome today's speaker, Professor Manasseh Begay. Professor Begay is a lecturer here at the Brown School and serves as the program manager for our SAGES program, which stands for Social Workers Advancing Through Grounded Education. That is a program that recruits, trains, and financially supports Brown School MSW students who are interested in completing 3 credits of their practica in Indian country. And it's also facilitated through our Booter Center for American Indian Studies. And in that work, he also collaborates very closely with our Office of Field Education. Prior to joining the Brown School, Professor Begay was at Denay College, where he assisted in building up their social work program through collaboration and curriculum development that is still currently in place there at Denay College. He taught and assisted in field placement, community social services and culture, and other introductory social work courses. Prior to his time at the Brown School, he wore many different hats, including spending time as a federal firefighter and as a San Juan County Sheriff Deputy. Begay is originally from Arizona and is enrolled with the White Mountain Apache tribe and is also Navajo. Dr. Begay received his MSW from New Mexico Highlands University and a bachelor's degree in liberal arts from the University of New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Professor Begay, who is here to share his work on trauma-informed policing from classroom to practice. Professor Begay, please take it away.
Thank you, first of all, everybody, for coming and listening to me. I hope that what I say is applicable to you and to what you're doing and future work you may do as well. That was a pretty thorough intro. I think you took about 2 minutes of my time that I was going to talk about myself. But just a little additional background. Myself, my wife, and my 2 kids moved here to St. Louis a little over a year ago to work here at WashU. We're very happy being here. My wife and I have been married since 2002, and we have 2 adults that we're raising. They're not necessarily adults, but they will be adults at some point. Our daughter is going to be turning 15 here in a few days and is really excited about that whole driver's license thing. Here in Missouri, you can get your provisional permit at 15. I don't know if that should be legal, but I can't believe she's getting ready to drive. And my son is 13, and they are also enjoying the city of St. Louis here. As was said before, I worked previously in Denay College in the social work program. I did some additional work at San Juan College in Farmington, New Mexico at their school. And before that, I was a police officer with the San Juan County Sheriff's Office. I worked in that field for 5 years. I did look to try to find a photo that I might have of myself in uniform, but I really couldn't. Back then, I didn't have a smartphone to be able to take pictures with. I was low and slow at getting one of those machines, but I have one now. So the picture I am going to share with you is not of myself actively as a deputy, but this was a picture of me, much shorter hair, going through police academy. And this would be pepper spray day. And I had just been sprayed in the face with pepper spray. I do not ever want to relive that experience. It wasn't fun. But if I look distressed in that picture, that is why. But I spent 5 years as a law enforcement officer, and prior to that, I was a firefighter for 10 years before moving into the field of social work. I would say that early on in my life, I never imagined myself moving into the role of law enforcement. But just due to life changes and circumstances, it turned into being a very viable option for myself. And in reality, a career I did enjoy for the time I was there. I learned quite a bit there and continue to learn since I have left my department, and continue to learn more about myself, but about different areas that I can continue to support the work that is done there, because there's just been a significant impact of law enforcement, and I would say the history of law enforcement and the changes it has gone through over generations, and a lot of good changes and some not as good. But one change that has kind of been consistent in law enforcement is this aspect of being traumatized in some way or another through encounters law enforcement have with people. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean that there was physical altercations that go on, but the fact that a lot of what law enforcement do, are trained to do, and are legally allowed to do are just very harmful acts to others. And one way that I've kind of grown to do is try to help support our community as well as law enforcement by creating this training to help decrease some of that trauma as much as we can, because a lot of the trauma is, as stated there, like in that unintentional process. I know that people aren't intentionally always trying to commit harm. Officers aren't always intentionally trying to commit harm. And it does happen though. And one of the creations of this training that I'll be talking about here, and some future work, hopefully to come and to follow this as well, to really look at ways to decrease that trauma that kind of goes on with law enforcement, and I would just say the criminal justice system in general. So as I said, I was in law enforcement for 5 years. During that time, I worked with the San Juan County Sheriff's Office. I wore a number of hats while I was there. I have always been involved in teaching, training, and I think every field that I've been in my life, and that continued in my law enforcement work. I worked as a lead instructor in the law enforcement training academy. Some of the courses I taught while I was there are custody, transportation of prisoners, Indian law, domestic violence. I was a reality-based training instructor, and I've taught similar courses with Navajo Nation Police Department, and teach now with Washington University Police Department as well. One thing that really didn't come into my mind until really later on in my life, as a firefighter, this never really even came to my mind. And as a officer, this really never was came to my mind as well, but kind of the impacts that I felt in my careers and the traumas that I have gone through. And I never really took a lot of time considering the additional traumas that my family went through during this period of time until later through my career in law enforcement and really more into my career as a social worker, that this really didn't come into play. And I eventually end up asking my wife, I'm like, in these positions that I've held and in this putting myself out there potentially in a very physical manner where my life in theory could have been threatened. I've never really felt threatened in that way, but wondering how my family considered my safety, my being, my health, and my emotional health during these times. And after I asked my wife this, she was like, yeah, it is something that I do think about on a regular basis. And the fear definitely does come into play. And my kids even later on told me after I left the job as an officer, and they're like, they were very happy that I did leave that job because they did have fear. Like, is my dad going to come home at night? And I was made sure I did everything I could on my part to be safe in this field, but I never really considered some of these unintentional traumas which go on in fields like this and in similar fields out there in the world. And I think that's additional part of the trauma that I will be talking about here. And it wasn't until I really became a social worker that I really spent a lot more time in reflection on the work that I did and who I was during those periods of my life, and then some of the impacts it had not only on my family, but on the people, the community that I worked with, as well as their family at the same time. And this cumulative trauma really carries over just expanses that we really don't always consider. We see what we do in media and on the news and things like that of like very specific incidences and occurrences, but I think that there's a lot that gets lost, whether things that we experience personally or vicariously through others, or as my family experienced through me going into work and the worries and stresses that kind of go on in a field like law enforcement, and just going through things that happen within that job. And things that I would say continue to have happened since I've left that job, and really areas that I've continued to grow in. I continue to work with law enforcement on a fairly regular basis in the ways that I can. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm a licensed alcohol and drug abuse counselor. And I really try to utilize a lot of the teachings and trainings that I've learned through my period, through my education, through courses that I've taught, and as well as trainings I've been involved in, and continue to grow in who I am as a clinician and who I am as an instructor, but in who I am with the community around me. Because as I have grown through my education, and I know early on, I have my bachelor's degree in liberal arts, but a major part of that was in psychology, and working with people in the community was a big part of that, because I knew at that point in my life that I think I do want to move into this social work, but really more into the clinical counseling world. Education was never something that I planned on doing. It more found me than I sought it out. But I remember on a call I went to, and for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to give this individual the name Jenny Martinez, but I was called by one of our local gas stations in the town I worked with, that this individual was there named Jenny Martinez, and Jenny Martinez was potentially causing problems at this location and had previously been trespassed from the location. So upon my arrival at the gas station, I see Jenny standing outside, and I've already met Jenny before, have kind of interacted with her in my previous, or in the years that I worked this area. And Jenny Martinez is somebody who struggles with paranoid schizophrenia, in that she regularly hears voices, has communication with these voices that speak to her, and really holds a lot of fear because of that. And part of my education up to this point, really in my psychology and in the way I interact with people, brought me to a place where I was able to, I would say, adequately and hopefully accurately and hopefully helpfully support Jenny through this process. Since Jenny was trespassed from this location, and she was actively there, it was an easy thing that I could do. I could arrest Jenny, I could take her to jail and book her in, and I could move about my day. That's not what happened in this circumstance, for a couple of different reasons. One thing, that I had a lot of time. I wasn't actively receiving calls, and it was a slow day, and I knew that this wasn't the right place for her to go. It would not be helpful for her, and it wouldn't support her as a human being. So through this process, that took quite a number of hours in reality. I was able to find a location for her to go with family members, after a lot of time searching that out and calling many people, to be able to help take care of her and support her, as she was kind of in this active state of schizophrenia, which was going on at the time. But one thing that was going on with her through this period of time is that I could see the fear that was going on in her body. And when you think about like fear, she like had that look of like eyes wide open, leaning backwards, trying to kind of protect herself, cover her. And I paid attention to myself at this time, and I looked at what I was doing. And I was doing the things that I was taught as an officer. I was trying to maintain my officer safety. I was standing in the positions that I was taught to stand in, and speaking in the tone that I was taught to speak in. And then I brought back this mind of this psychology and working with people. And I realized that I could do something different. And in this period, I changed my tone of voice. I lowered myself so I wasn't standing over her, and I brought her at eye level with me. And I could see her body respond to that. And she was like, "What did you do? What just happened?" And a change occurred in her that opened her up to be able to see me and to be able to accurately converse and work with me after I chose to make that change in the way I was speaking and interacting with Jenny. And after that period, I really changed the way I interacted with a lot of the population I worked with, because I didn't want to continue to support some of those traumas that I guess we do in the field of law enforcement that really happens on a regular basis. We do things like arrest people, and you see in the picture, somebody's has their hands handcuffed. And if you've ever been handcuffed, it's a really uncomfortable position. It's painful. This person's getting put in the back seat of a vehicle. And if you Imagine with your arms behind you, handcuffed together, they're not in a position that they can freely move, and you're trying to sit back on your arms. It makes it even more comfortable. I've been in this position a number of times through my training as an officer, and it's not a fun place to be. And it really is like what's said on that, dehumanizing. You lose a sense of yourself, and you absolutely lose your freedom. You no longer are able to do the things that you want to do, that you can do. And then you get entered into the system that really struggles to help support the individuals that's a part of. And I'm not talking about law enforcement by itself. I'm talking about just the criminal justice system as a whole. And really the work that needs to be done in the criminal justice system is extreme, and is significant to continue to actually create real positive change. I've tried to create change in my personal life after that interaction with Jenny, and in my professional life as an officer after that point, and how I interacted with people and how I worked with people. And I could accurately see changes that occurred from that point forward and a lot of the work I did. But this trauma that goes on through this criminal justice system, through law enforcement, is significant. Like I said, it's significant to not just myself, it was significant to my family as well. But for the people that are actively involved in this process, they go through this level of trauma, through going through the court system, going through just arrest by itself, is a really uncomfortable process. There's nothing fun about it. There's nothing that is enjoyable about it. I've heard some people that I have arrested before, like talking in a way that they were actually excited and happy to get arrested, but I think that was really more of a masking the true emotions that were probably going on and who they were at that period of time, and probably a level of victimization that goes on, and just the continued consequences that go on after that through the legal system and court costs, fines, fees, probation, and just the continued process that has a lot of struggles. And as I came to WashU here, they looked at my CV and they were kind of thinking about, what are we going to do with this guy? And this course came up, Trauma of Policing Among Marginalized Populations in America. And I feel that course adequately reflected my life experiences, and as well as some of the work that I had already begun doing with law enforcement. And I was very excited about this course and taking this course from others. And here highlighted in this course is our syllabus, but I just want to highlight, you can read the whole thing, what's written in black. And one of my goals was highlight the role of the social worker in eradicating police violence towards marginalized groups. This is not something that I wrote in here. It was already created and was already in our system here as courses are held. But I felt that highlighted area really spoke to me in ways that I could continue to work with not just the students that were within my class, but a way that I could engage in the community around me through this course, through my students, and through the curriculum there. As with a lot of classes, there are these group presentations that we have to do. And I told my students, let's hold off on the group presentation. Let's focus on some of the other projects that we have going on. And this was this moment in my life where I said, we can use this class, we can do some of this work actively through the curriculum here. And this is when I began to reach out to the law enforcement agencies locally here at the St. Louis area, and contacted and began discussions with the Washington University Police Department And in those early discussions, it was, okay, how can we work together? Your social work, we're law enforcement, and how do we make this blend happen? I'm like, it's easier than you think, because I've already lived this. I already know what this kind of looks like, and I have already started practicing some of these things when I was an officer. And the fact that I was an officer really helped support, as they would call it, I had the street cred on my side, being a prior officer, to be able to bring these discussions to the table. And I began talking about some of the trainings that I will really enjoy collaborating with the department, and really trauma-informed training to help support the department here. And it's a similar training to a course I taught with Navajo Nation Police Department in the past. But through this collaboration, I really wanted to continue the work that I had already begun and wanted to continue to move forward. So I kind of began that and spoke to my students and said, this is what I want to do. Are you on board with doing this and getting involved in this process? And they really jumped at the opportunity to take part in this and to be able to create some curriculum to help support their community, I think, first, but to also help in this eradicating police violence towards marginalized populations. So we all took this role and very seriously, and moving forward and creating the work that kind of began here and continues to go on here. But WashU also, the police department stood out, and they said, yes, we definitely want this training. We want to be a part of this, but we want more. We really want to get some more training about some self-care for our personnel, some ways that we can help our personnel decrease levels of stress, and to not bring home trauma on a daily basis to them and their family. And if you don't know that law enforcement have a much shorter lifespan than other people. Statistics are saying like up to 20 years less lifespan if were an officer. You can potentially live a significant time less than somebody else. Children of officers are higher rates of suicide and other things. And they said, we really need some support in this. And my students said, yeah, absolutely. We want to help in that as well. And in reality, if you think about that, if you're an officer and you're going to work and you're at high levels of stress, high levels of all these emotions going on, it's going to be difficult to go into the job and with an open mind, and the ability to be self-reflective is not there. So we absolutely included that into this training. And the next few slides, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but these were some of the objectives of this training that we created to support law enforcement. And I know in the objectives, it talks about domestic violence, sexual assault victims, families, but in reality, this is applicable to the training that we created was applicable to about any forms of trauma that kind of go on in a person's life from a day-to-day basis. And as we kind of continue to the second part of that training, these strategies of self-reflective strategies, mindfulness are skills that can benefit, I would say, everybody here that can hear me out there in Zoom land and wherever this is getting live streamed to, that it's a very important part of helping us on many different levels, but really on a biological level, it really helps to create change in our own personal lives on a regular basis. decrease the levels of trauma that we go through and increase the ability of ourselves to really reflect, stabilize ourselves. But with that process of stabilizing ourselves, we stabilize the people that are around us. Just like when I was speaking with Jenny, I changed my tone, I changed my persona, and I changed who I am. And it brought her to a state of stability in herself and who she was as a person. And that fear that she was like holding back, and that she probably knew very closely to her, it fell off of her. And the potential trauma that could have occurred in that scenario fell off of her as well. And that is something that's really important for a field like law enforcement. It's a place that we need to, I would say, as a prior officer, you want to be trusted, and you want people to help support some of the positive work that you're doing. And you want to continue to actually create change in not necessarily yourself, but in the community as a whole, to help people in the community. That hasn't been the history, though, and that isn't always the history that's told, I should say. Back in 2000, I believe 2014, Ferguson Police Department was highlighted after the shooting of Michael Brown. And the department in our country that looks at police departments across the country is the Department of Justice. And in the report that they created after reviewing the Ferguson Police Department's roles, just one of the statement I pulled from it is provide officers with tools, training to better respond to persons in physical or mental health crisis, and to those with intellectual disabilities to help avoid unnecessary injuries, increase community trust, and make officers safer. I would say make the community safer as well through that whole process. And again, like I said, law enforcement doesn't necessarily have a history of replicating what is said there. At least that's not what we see. And I've definitely seen that not occurring as far as being a trauma-informed officer and being an officer that supports the community. I've seen in my personal career as an officer in some circumstances that are out there, and really, I know my department really tried to push respecting the community and following the rules that they were taught through the academy and that area. But we also get officers from other departments and other places. And I remember a specific incident where we did have a suicidal subject, and we were eventually able to bring that person down. But it came to that point where handcuffs were getting put on this individual. The initial intent was to bring him into the hospital to get checked on. But where some level of violence occurred and an officer ended up getting kicked and spit on. And this officer did not respond in a way that they should have. And they received similar training from the department that they came from. And they said, if this was my previous department, we would have responded a lot differently than what our officers did, and trying to regain control and put this individual back into our vehicle. But this officer wanted to respond in a different way, and potentially a violent manner. But again, this is part of this training and part of these things that we potentially get taught through the departments that we go through in our lives, of how we do things a little bit differently. And this is just one incident that I could tell you out of many where this has been the case. I've worked with a state police officer after a police chase, and we finally were able to catch, I guess, the people that we were chasing, and they weren't willing to talk with the state police officer. They said, I will talk to you, but I'm not going to talk to him. And again, it kind of goes back towards being that trauma-informed person, that trauma-informed officer, to be able to create that space there of mutual respect. Even in that circumstance, you can absolutely do that to be able to do the work that you really need to do. And that's the way that I bring it to officers. I'm helping you to do the work that you need to do in a way that is more open to the person that you're talking with, as well as better for yourself as an individual, because this can be replicated to family life, to all the things that you are going to do. And when we become trauma-informed people, we realize the widespread impact that trauma can have on others when we can come at it from that trauma-informed lens. And this is to quote my students in the final paper that they had for this course. And just so you all know that they all passed with flying colors after going through the training and all the things that I had them do in this course, that they really enjoyed the process and actively responded to the process, and felt like they were able to create change in who they are and what they are doing in the areas that they really wanted to continue to create change. So a lot of these goals are like, decreased trauma is really one of the main aspects of it. We don't want to continue to traumatize people that are already in an active potential traumatic process and a crisis situation in their life, whether like a domestic violence incident had just occurred, a sexual assault, or that just their mental health problems are actively significantly affecting their person. We want to respond in a way that is trauma-informed. And I would say that as an officer, absolutely we need to do that, but also as clinicians out there in the world, as people that are working with the community, to be able to utilize some of these skills. And the thing that we talk about in this training is like the biological responses, some of the potential biological responses that go on within a person's body when they are going through these traumatic incidences, how we can stabilize people that are actively going through this trauma, and then be able to create a mechanism for communication, which is just I would say it's a win-win on everybody's part, as well as to decrease trauma, but also bring levels of trust and support into that individual. Even people that I've arrested have been like, thank you for helping me in this time. And they appreciated, I don't know if they appreciated getting arrested, but in the way that I responded to them in the circumstances. And I don't know about you, I do not like getting pulled over, and even people that I've given tickets to, I would say 80% of the time say thank you at the end of a traffic stop, which kind of blows my mind sometimes, but it really comes into play in the way that we talk and interact with others. But there's a lot that goes on that we really don't consider. And that experience of trauma, like that goes on a daily basis with whether it's the people that we work with or whether it's with ourselves. And some things that law enforcement and departments around are not really good at addressing that and looking at that and looking at ways to cope with things. It's definitely taken more light in more recent years, but how we look at the trauma that we go through on a regular basis becomes a big deal. because as we go through this process, it creates a aspect of desensitization to the world around you. There's this aspect of gallows humor, and like Sigmund Freud, if you can understand what he's saying here, it's really because my body doesn't want to think less of myself at that period of time. If you think about, I don't want to show my emotion. I need to be strong in who I am. So instead of showing my emotion, I bring humor and light to the situation that's going on. And in reality, it can be very difficult trying to show emotion as an officer. As a clinician, it's very difficult to, like, we don't want to necessarily show the emotion as often, like, wow, this person just told me that, or this person is going through this thing. And what's going on in my brain as an individual is like some levels of potential shock and like I don't understand how to even move forward. And this is where humor comes into play with, I would say, officers regularly go to this to forego going through the emotions of this process. And when we don't allow ourselves that opportunity, it causes us to be desensitized over periods of time, and just to not look at the world as it really is, and not looking at individuals as who they really are. And they become potentially a statistic, as some departments, potentially out there use point systems, like you get a point if you make an arrest, you get a point if you do this, and you have to have this many amount of points in a shift, or this many amount of points over a week. And it's a very unhealthy way of doing this job, because it, again, desensitizes the individuals that you're working with, instead of looking at creating change in the community that you're working with. And this is where I think that there are other ways that we need to continue to reach out to law enforcement agencies and other departments just in the world, the criminal justice system, at looking at ways that we can continue to create change out there, and just be able to move forward in supporting the community and what they actually really need. Because this trauma and the stress that comes through this job, and then through the interactions that we go through, even when I was an officer, because I've been pulled over, like I would say the first time I was pulled over, I think it was for speeding, early in my life. And it kind of, it scared me early on. And I think I was 17 or 18 at the time. And I'm sure many of you feel the same way when, like, an officer is behind you. You feel this level of fear that kind of goes on, and this level of stress. I know I do still. When I was an officer in the town that I was working in, and I know all the other officers that are there, I still feel that stress. I live, and I think part of that is some of the stuff that we're talking about here in a bit, and some of the reasons why, like, places like Ferguson were hit pretty hard, is that there were some levels of bias that were going on. I lived in the city of Santa Fe for a period of my life, and in 1 month period, I think I was pulled over about 20 to 30 times, and that just, I got 0 tickets out of that month. And it was all about coming up and wanting to identify myself and who I was and what I'm doing. And that fear kind of continues to live in who I am as a person, because I still feel that. And like I said, I knew all the officers in the department I was working with, but I still kind of hold some of that fear in there years later and into now. I still, like, it brings me a level of stress when officers are following me behind. But as an officer in my unit driving around, I didn't necessarily feel a lot of fear then because I was actively working. And this other part that causes some levels of desensitization and I guess stress that goes on. And I've seen it in videos I see of officers who are on duty who you can tell they're in like high stress environments and high stress situations. They respond in a way that they don't know how to act, and they move into this place where they're actively engaged in a crisis at that period of time, which is a very unhealthy place for an officer to be. They shouldn't be a person actively going through a crisis when they're out there trying to support the community in a way. And this continued work that I try to do helps try to allow for decreases of stress for that officer. And I think this is where the department here at WashU was like, we really need some education and support for our officers to help them out as individuals. Because we know that they're stressed. We see that they're stressed, but we don't really know how to deal with it as a department. So we need to find those collaborations. And that's one of the main ways that we can do that is to create these collaborations. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides, because the work of an officer is extremely stressful. And you get a very skewed view of the world because as an officer, you really interact with a very minor percentage of the population. They say somewhere around 2% of the population or less you interact with. And we see that 2% as an officer, but we apply it to the population as a whole on an occasion. And this is where we start as officers becoming desensitized to who the individuals that we are actually working with are. And we start applying different ways of doing things to everybody instead of treating each individual as a person. And some of the work that I do here is to really try to work at creating that individual aspect with a person and creating that relationship that the officer not only needs to have with the community around them, but that relationship that the officer needs to have with themselves. And I think that's something that we need to do as like people that serve the communities. We need to have a really accurate and effective relationship with ourselves as a person. Because if we don't have that, it really makes it difficult for us to continue to create the change in the world that we want to around us if we're struggling with ourselves as an individual. And really re-engaging with ourselves in that process becomes extremely important, because you don't have that opportunity to move out when you're actively going from call to call to call to bring that level of stress down unless you really intentionally put that time into your life. Because as officers, you're put into a lot of scenarios that you don't necessarily want to be in as an officer. And the role of an officer is much broader than it probably really should be. I remember many times going to calls to help talk to a parent's kid. So I was called to help parent someone else's child. I've been called to take and deal with rattlesnakes that are around people's houses. And I can tell you, like, stress was very high during that period of time. And it wasn't a fun period. And I would never want to do that call again or any of that. It wasn't one occasion. I wouldn't want to do any of those calls again for that matter. But that level of stress that you're put under, it has a cumulative effect on the body and a cumulative effect on the individual. And if they don't know how to cope and deal with it, they need to really find ways that they can do that. And the two ways that my students utilized in creating this area of self-reflection of like themselves, but also that some of this, the Gibbs really reflective cycle, you can also use it as like an after action review for departments to really look at incidences after they occur, but also engage the individual in like their, like, what did I experience in that period of time? What did I feel in that period of time? And how can I look back at that period of time and do things differently, potentially to decrease the trauma? And I've done this with myself in calls that I've been on. I do it in a clinical setting when I'm working with clients. What can I do better next time? I use this in a when I'm reflect after a class or maybe after a period of teaching, like what can I do better this next time and help the students, but make sure that I am also doing the things that I need to do to take care of myself, as well as this mindfulness aspect and some forms of meditation to really, those are the things that we can do on a regular basis in our lives, like take 5 minutes for yourself and close the door and spend some time in a breathing exercise or really reflecting on where you're at in your life at that point in time. And again, I said, like, this is like the Brown School here, our deans for the Brown School created this statement, and this is what we want to do as an institution, but this is really what social work is creating these collaborations, creating these partnerships we have with the community, looking at the person and environment framework and putting the values that we want out there into the world. And some of the goals are this systemic oppression, racism, create an equitable world for the community around us. And I think that is really a phenomenal statement about who we are as social workers. I'm going to pull up this next slide just really briefly, but this looks at us as social workers and some of the things that we really hope to achieve through this field. And I know that a lot of this speaks personally to me, especially this service aspect. I think is a huge part of who we are. We put ourselves out there to support others. I don't do this work as much for myself as I do for the people in my community and the people around me. And then just growing collaborations. This specific time, we collaborated with law enforcement. There are so many collaborations out there in the community that we can have through organizations that we work with, using the Brown School and social work in a way that we can continue to create resources for change, whether that's through our students and practicum opportunities that they can be involved in, or some of the expertise that we hold as individuals to help those out there in the world. And I regularly reach out to experts in the community and say, help me teach my students, come and talk to my courses, come and help me with this curriculum to be able to continue the collaboration that we have. And just looking at some of the future work that I can really see benefiting our institution here at Washington University, but institutions that you have out there in the world. For whatever reason, I have been always been a part of the crew. I would say not as much as a firefighter, but involved in the criminal justice system in one way or another. And a lot of my time as a clinician, as a mental health practitioner, I worked in a 28-day facility for DWI treatment, as well as doing a lot of work in some community organizations, providing clinical counseling for the population that is involved with the criminal justice system. And just the amount of need that's there on top of criminal justice reform is incredible. And I think these are areas that I'm continuing to look at how we can continue to create change in this community here that we have, whether it's in St. Louis or where you're at out there in the world. We have multiple versions of expertise out there. I may not be the expert in all these areas, but I do know people that are experts. And if we can use those people to help support the work that we want to do, we become experts at some point in time, as well as through like continuing research and the work to be able to move the work that we want to do forward. And it really begins with just finding those areas of need that we become passionate about. Like I said, law enforcement was my family for many years. Firefighting was my family for many years. This educational community is my family now. That doesn't mean I disregard who was my family before. So I continue to try to help support that and help support those populations that have really grown to have want to support and in so many different ways. And I've said this to a lot of my students. For whatever reason, people come up to me in my community when I'm back home in Arizona and New Mexico and I'm on the reservation. A lot of my community members that I don't know, they come up to me and they're like, "Hey, I'm having problems with this," or "Can you talk to me about this?" or "Can you talk to me about that?" And I'm like, how do they know that I work in this field? How do they know that I'm a clinician? They don't. But for whatever reason, this work has found me over the years, and I really do enjoy this work and want to continue to provide in the ways that I can, because the role of social workers in eradicating, and you guys can fill in the blanks there for what you want to help support, what you want to help grow, but what some of those areas that we need to decrease, like trauma is one of the big areas that I'm very passionate about decreasing, is how are we going to work at accurately doing that in the areas that we're at and the collaborations that we make and then the communities that we're all involved with, so that we don't bring harm to others, to the world around us. And I think that's a good social work goal to have just in general. It makes us better people, it makes our families better, and it makes the community around us better. And that's my 2 cents on the subject. And I will go to, I think there were some questions I saw in the chat. I really wasn't looking, but
yeah, I've got several here, and I'm going to try to get through as many of them as possible because they're really great questions. And thank you so much for that presentation. So the first question that I have is kind of around the difference between and strategies for first getting buy-in from police officers and entire departments to even engage in the training in the first place, and then getting them to actually take it, from classroom to practice. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how can you even first get the foot in the door to get them that training and then the implementation phase.
Yeah, I think for myself, it was fairly easy just because, again, I have a background in law enforcement, and I have taught similar courses to law enforcement in the past. And I think this is where we find collaborators to really help support the work that we want to do. Because sometimes I wish I could say that I do everything on my own, but I really don't. I really rely on a lot of others out there to help support and make those connections, whether it's for myself, for the work that I want to do, for the community as a whole. And some of the future work that I'm trying to do within the community here of St. Louis and the criminal justice work. I've started creating collaborations with some of our local organizations here to be able to continue to make that outreach into the areas that are needed. But in reality, within law enforcement, there are a number of people that want to continue to see change happen. I would say not all departments across the country would fall into that, but I would say a lot do, and a lot really want to see change. And to make their job easier is really one of my goals. I want to make their job easier by them being able to reflect on what they're actually going through at that period and on that call, and to be able to help the people around them. And I think one problem with law enforcement, not necessarily as a whole, but there are very few options that they have available to them other than arrests at times. And that makes some of the work difficult a little bit. And I think that's where creating more options is some of the next big work that really needs to get done, and how are we going to move forward. But really creating the collaborations and just finding that person in that department. And sometimes it takes multiple phone calls and kind of being the squeaky wheel. You'll get greased eventually, and it just is going to happen at some point. And if it doesn't get greased, the wheel breaks, and it's going to happen one way or another down the road. So, but proactivity is better than trying to fix something that's broken.
Yeah, and oh man, I wish we had more time. We were 1 minute over, so unfortunately, I can't get to the rest of the questions. But I just want to say thank you so much for your work and the empathy that you clearly bring to this work. I personally felt such a sense of value and service and humanness that you bring to this. And I think that the rest of I've gotten some really great comments in the chat. And Professor Manasseh put his email in I'm going to put it to everybody here. So if you want to contact Manasseh, follow up, please do so. A recording of today's program is going to be shared on YouTube as soon as I get it processed in a couple of days. And you're also invited to register for upcoming programs as well. So thank you all for being here. But Professor Begay, a special thank you to you for your work and for sharing this work with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone.